feeling. It's a great way of just kind of settling down after a busy day. And we encourage you to use 2 words because it's complicated times. So if people could do that, that would be great. Excited and a little drained. Right. Busy and yet engaged, hopeful. These words are great. And one of the reasons I like the photos on the slide is, you know, the picture of the tree with the ice. It's incredibly beautiful, right? But it's also a little complicated because it's fleeting, but also, you know, what else is covered with the ice and is there any? So in any case, it's always good to reflect on one's own feelings, but also it's kind of important to know who else is in the room and how they're feeling. So thank you very much for taking those few minutes, and hopefully it's getting you know, help just everyone calm down and settle down a little bit. SEL4US, SEL4NJ. SEL4US is an affiliate of a much larger organization called SEL4US. At the moment, there's 19 states that are part of this network, and it's growing all of the time. Every state kind of interprets its, you know, does its own thing. However, overall, we share a shared vision of promoting the importance of social emotional learning and related approaches. And it's an incredibly robust, lovely network that we learn a lot from, that we hope we contribute to. But just to let you know that this is a national effort, and we are just thrilled to be a part of SEL4US. So if you know of anyone in any of the states, please encourage them to join if there is an SEL4 network in their state. And in those states where there are none, feel free to contact us and we can put you in touch with the right people to start one. Also, SEL4NJ, for some of you that may not know about SEL4NJ, we were established late 2018, right after SEL4US was founded. We were one of the founding partners along with SEL4 Massachusetts, one of the founding states. We were fortunate in New Jersey. We had a much smaller yet incredibly mighty coalition that sort of was the foundation for SEL4NJ. Since then, however, our membership has grown tremendously. And in fact, in the last 12 months, we've almost increased by 50% and are growing all the time. Our members are comprised of schools, associations and organizations, and SEL providers broadly defined, which we'll be looking at in a minute. And this is very important and it's very intentional because we're all about coordination and sharing a similar voice and kind of silo busting. So we're very pleased about that. This is also a volunteer organization. We did receive 501c3 status, which we're very proud of. It was a lot of work, and we're growing. So please, if you know of anyone who hasn't joined, please send along their details. So what do we do at SEL4NJ? Number one, it's to build awareness about SEL and related efforts. It's to connect. Here in New Jersey, that's an incredibly important part of what we do, is connecting all sorts of interested parties, as well as supporting best practice implementation. Because at the end of the day, what matters is how SEL broadly defined is actually implemented in schools, because that's how it begins to touch humans, students, staff, everyone within the school community. So those are kind of our focus areas. In addition, we mentioned SEL broadly defined. Well, SEL broadly defined is an umbrella term that we use that includes all of these things: mental and physical health, whole child, school climate work, trauma-informed approach, character education. All of these things fall under the broad umbrella of SEL. And later on this afternoon, we'll be kind of talking about how this can be integrated into the fabric and the daily life of a school. But it's worth keeping in mind, we're talking about all of these things. Likewise, what have we been up to and what do we do? I'm just checking the time. early on in 2019, we thought, well, we need to kind of get the lay of the land to begin with. So we undertook a very comprehensive landscape analysis. I'll be talking about that in a little bit. And then COVID happened, a global pandemic. So we continued that work. However, we also realized that adults' SEL and emotional well-being was incredibly important. So we started a focus with a lovely partnership with PureEdge to support teachers that first summer after COVID. Throughout the last 20 months, we have held town halls and listening sessions. We provided testimony to the legislature. We presented to many organizations and associations about SEL, broadly defined. We've had articles published in the NJEA. One of our colleagues through SEL for California produced a great SEL video that we've been able to share. We've also received funding from the New York Jets and launched a grant opportunity, which closes at 11:59 p.m. this Friday. So it's not too late at all to apply if you're still interested. All the details are on our website. We've also SEL Day, which we'll be talking about in a minute, which is an incredibly high visible project. And throughout all of this, we have an equity lens and a COVID-informed lens. And also I should say that I think one of the most important and really valuable outcomes of the last 20 months or so has been the continuing involvement, engagement, and collaboration with all of the wonderful partners across New Jersey, the state associations and organizations. It's really been tremendous, including the New Jersey Department of Education. So going on, the landscape analysis working groups, we highlighted early on that these were the key areas, and there were many, and we know this is not comprehensive, but this was a great place to start in terms of understanding how these different focus areas can really encourage, integrate, and promote a focus on social emotional learning. And from this, we were amazed at the number of people who signed up to help be on these landscape analysis teams, 90 50 different organizations. They worked through a process over 12 months, created amazing work that is to this day informing and continues to inform and is a work in progress on SEL throughout the state of New Jersey. In 2020, we realized that we needed to revisit this through a COVID and equity informed lens. The teams regrouped with some new members and existing members. And from that, we've been able to begin implementation of some of the many, many amazing recommendations. This is still very much a work in progress, and we encourage and welcome and invite you all to join one of these groups and help shape and form the next work going forward. So there's a whole, that's a whole long conversation to talk about what these are doing. So maybe contact us and we'd love to have that conversation. So for the first half of 2022, what is SEL for New Jersey's plans? As mentioned, we have a grant opportunity available, incredibly exciting. We're going to be launching that. It's for professional development for SEL integration for teachers. Included in that for successful grantees will be part of a professional learning cohort. So that will be launched in January. We're also continuing to build and grow and extend the series of examples that we're going to be talking about later on. We're going to continue to collaborate with partners in areas of opportunity to amplify important messages as well as to fill gaps within the state. And also, we're always listening, always connecting, because this is our alliance. It's our collaboration, all of yours. We're all in this together. And also, very importantly, an incredibly important day for us is SEL Day, and March 11th, 2022. We will be officially launching this in January. There's a whole lot of ways New Jersey can use SEL Day to celebrate, to share, to inspire all the amazing SEL work that is being done within the state. Last year, it was incredibly exciting and it was incredibly successful. We hope to, kind of build on that in a serious way over, this, coming on March 11th, 2022. So a little later on, we'll be talking a little bit about some ideas about that as well. So with that said, I am going to turn this over to Dr. Maurice Elias, who is going to provide us an overview of SEL from the national level. So Maurice, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and turn it over to you.
All right, thanks, Liz. And I'm going to see if I can accomplish sharing my screen. Never something we take for granted these days. All right, and Liz, you can take over letting people in.
Yeah, definitely, thank you.
Okay. All right, so I'm not sure if you can see my PowerPoint.
Yes.
All right, let me get it to be a little larger so you can see it more easily. All right, so there are indeed some national trends for us to talk about. And the first one I want to talk about is the fact that you may have heard some pushback going on about SEL. And it's important for us to know that very often in good work, there are people
Daddy's downstairs
who are organized
is upstairs.
and negative. And that's exactly what we're seeing out in many parts of the United States, small pockets of folks that are trying to use SEL for their own particular political purposes. They're trying to pigeonhole SEL as some form of indoctrination of children, as a sort of a Trojan horse for delivering critical race theory information, as a way of trying to turn our kids into something that parents don't want them to be. And we have to be very clear about what SEL is, that it's a process, it involves teachable skills, that it's evidence-based, equity-focused, and it's based in human development, that we cannot not have SEL any more than we cannot have oxygen. And so the idea we can remove SEL from schools is completely preposterous. But that's what people are saying, and you hear a lot of it, but it's certainly not predominant, and we'll talk about that. You'll probably get a copy of this at some point, but David Adams has a wonderful article in the New York Daily News where he really refutes a lot of the arguments that people have raised about the negatives of SEL. David Adams is the co-director of not only SEL for New York, but also SEL Dec. So here's another area where we're all seeing this. We're all involved in what is called a VUCA environment: volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. And SEL is a guide for how we are going to get through this. And it's very important. First, SEL helps us understand, so what does it mean when we're in this kind of environment? Well, one of the first things it means is that we don't hear other people as clearly as we should. And so, as I mentioned when I spoke to the NJPSA Council earlier this week, that we all have to make the assumption of misunderstanding. That is, we have to assume that people are so stressed that just because we say something doesn't mean they got it. And that means that we're going to have to really attend to the social and emotional issues that are around us. Everybody's emotions are heightened. Everybody's feeling more stress. We know there's a lot of feelings of loss and anxiety around. It means that people become less creative, that relationships get a little strained. Humor is something that we just don't dispense as easily. So we know all this is going on. And so one thing that we know about SEL, and this is becoming increasingly clear in schools, that yeah, SEL skills are important, but let's follow broader SEL guidance. And that's what the bolded terms are. Be reassuring, patient, and understanding with each other. Be encouraging of one another. Practice empathy and really trying to walk in other people's shoes. Be willing to create brave space where people can interact, even though what they say may not be perfect. They've got to know that no one's going to jump down their throat. Let's be willing to communicate over and over and over again, knowing that people are not hearing and reading fully. Let's talk about having mindful moments for staff, for kids in our schools. We know these things work. And if these things are not in place, we are never going to recover from learning loss. So that's why people are turning to SEL. You'll hear SEL mentioned so often in the news media, in newspapers. Social and emotional learning is really at the forefront of everyone's thinking. But we have to not get overly hung up first on skills. We have to first focus on the emotional guidance that SEL is giving us. Liz mentioned that SEL for US is growing, and not only is it growing, it is still growing. And these are 5 states that are actively seeking to join SEL for US even as we're speaking. There is more and more recognition among administrators, parents, and teachers that SEL is valuable. So, we're not just a sort of an isolated group. A lot of people feel this way. And here's some very current and excellent news. The CDC has come out with some fabulous materials for parents, helping parents understand that SEL is an essential part of bringing up children properly. It's essential for schools, it's essential for homes. So by that, we simply mean that in the wider trend, more and more people are getting on the SEL bandwagon, and we shouldn't let ourselves be deterred by the few loud, disconnected, and politically motivated people that are anti-SEL. So March 11th is SEL Day. The theme is Finding Common Ground. As Liz said, SEL Day 2021, look at this impact. 12 million views, 8,000 mentions, 50,000 likes, participation from 69 countries, every state, and we're going to do better this year. We'll do better if everybody participates. If everybody in New Jersey does a little bit, we can do some extraordinary things. The actual launch day is December 13th.
Come down.
For SEL Day.
I can't, I'm in a meeting.
And it's nice to know somebody's in a meeting. Glad to hear it. We're actually all in a meeting. And here are some toolkits that are available to you that can help you in your school, in your organization, participate easily and painlessly in SEL Day. And so for you, next step is to really join in this movement actively and go to selday.org and really help push the tide of SEL forward. So the national trend is that there are a couple of bumps in the road, but SEL is growing by leaps and bounds in terms of importance and favorability. And now I'm going to turn things over to Bill Trushheim. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And Bill's going to take us to the next segment.
Great, and I'm going to start sharing my screen again. So thank you, Maurice. And for everyone in New Jersey, we will be reiterating everything Maurice just shared about SEL Day. So just hopefully you will not be able to miss it, and those toolkits are fabulous. So with that said, we're going to turn it over to Bill Trushheim to kind of share with us our series of examples and introduce what this is all about. So over to you, Bill.
Thank you, Liz, and thank you, Maurice. The discussion about some of this pushback about SEL and some other things that happened really, I guess it really started in earnest over the summer. It caused us to have a conversation among our leadership team. And the conversation really centered on, okay, how we are an organization that supports SEL in schools and SEL in general. So how can we serve a role in addressing some of the concerns that have been placed? And as Maurice said, it is fortunately a minority of people that are doing this, and we do believe that there are motivations that are causing it to happen. But we decided that the best service that we could be to all of you and to the SEL community and the educational community would be to come up with a series of what we call data briefs, which were designed to be a 1 or 2 page document each. And these documents would basically spell out in layman's terms examples of how social emotional learning is integrated in well, at this point, 11 different topics. And we're going to go through those 11 today. But we know that, by the way, SEL is integrated into more than 11 topics. And if any of you on this call today have an idea for doing a brief, we welcome you to do it. It's not, it doesn't have to be, we're not talking about writing a dissertation here. We're talking about, writing something in plain language that will help your colleagues understand. And these data briefs are listed on the homepage of our website. And certainly our discussion of these briefs today, along with looking at the actual documents, you'll see that they are not they're not all involved. They're to the point, and hopefully they're going to be useful. And I'm happy to see that we have someone on the call that have used them for staff training, and that's great, Jennifer. Thanks for sharing that. So the series really is, we've divided it up today into several segments. I'm going to do the first segment, which is SEL and academic learning. But we know that the impact of SEL is much more broad than just in academic learning. But we really thought that we should start with this particular brief in our series because some of the concern that was placed about SEL was that schools would pay more attention to SEL than academics. And we heard that from parents. We've read it in the newspaper. We've seen articles written in journals about that concern. And we just want to make the point that that's absolutely the furthest thing from the truth. The SEL is not in a position to supplant academic learning. It is really in a position to support academic learning. And in this particular brief, which is, I say, the first in our series, in this brief, we do cite some research that really attests to the fact that SEL is important in supporting learning. We do know several points that SEL skills do help students learn better. We also understand that if we're talking about student achievement, it's really important to have a balanced view of what that is. And what I mean by that is that if you were to read the papers and you were to talk about schools or teachers or whatever, you begin to get the feeling that student achievement is defined by those few days of standardized tests that students take. And that is a very narrow and erroneous view of what learning is all about. So we know that SEL skills do facilitate learning in the classroom. They also, there's research that shows that good SEL skills really help high school and college graduation rates. We also know that SEL is important, and you'll hear later from Christy about the connection between SEL skills and the careers and the workplace. And we know that it supports those things. So one of our concerns is that, if parents really understood this, these facts, and understood, I don't expect them to go and read all the research, but if they were to look at these facts with an open-minded way, I don't believe that they could believe that that SEL could possibly do anything but support learning and student achievement. And we know that the acquisition of SEL skills are really important in terms of student success in the long run beyond school, more so perhaps than that advanced proficient on a standardized test. So that's really where we're starting. And what I'd like to do at this point is to turn it over to Liz and Trish, who are going to talk about the relationships in school, the learning environment, classrooms, and how SEL impacts all of those things. So I thank you for your attention. I hope you'll look for these briefs and you'll be able to use them. So, and I'd like to thank everybody for joining today. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Bill. That was a great introduction. And just so you know, you will all be getting this PowerPoint, and these are hot links that will take you right to our website and the PDFs, but also these are right on the home page as well. And you click on them and you get a downloadable PDF. Because we want to have these be as accessible as possible. So I'm going to just spend a few minutes talking about this next cluster of climate and relationships. And I'm not going to go through the 3 individual briefs. They're all 1 page, 1.5 pages, very accessible. But overall, you know, there's such a focus on SEL and school climate and DEI work. And yet, you know, it all begins with having a positive climate and strong relationships. And that's you know, sort of reciprocal relationship between strong SELs, that a positive school climate is created by the strong social emotional skills of those humans within that school. And likewise is that within that positive climate, all those humans can practice those social emotional skills. So it's very much a reciprocal relationship. And so how does a school, these briefs talk about how do you actually make this happen? And the first brief, for instance, is very simple. It talks about the simple things that can go a long way to building relationships, making sure you welcome everyone by their name. It's really basic. It doesn't cost any money. It just has to be very intentional. So those sorts of creating a positive climate, beginning to build relationships, are key. We also know that emotions are contagious. And so it's very important that the adults within the school environment are aware of their importance of modeling behavior, of, you know, not only showing students how to do it, but spreading those positive emotions. So within these briefs as well, it's talked about how important that is, which helps. And again, these are accessible. So if you have someone who might not be well versed in the jargon of SEL, these are very relatable ideas of, you know, how important emotions are, how you have to have a positive, as Dr. Comer says, you have to have a positive relationship in order to have any significant learning. Likewise, the last brief talking about emphasizing caring relationships to support relationships and creating classrooms that celebrate who students are. A DEI is not something separate, is having a culturally aware classroom is what makes all those students feel welcome, safe, valued, respected, welcomed. Everyone should be welcomed, and to feel that it is their school environment, it's their classroom. And so by doing that, these briefs talk about, in fact, I think the second brief, creating classrooms that celebrate who students are, have some wonderful questions and kind of conversation starters for students. So these are intended to be very practical as well, and to just illustrate over and over again how important a positive climate and relationships are to thriving students and thriving schools, and how we can all do it just by how we are. It doesn't need to be a program or anything like that. So with that said, I'm going to finish, and I am going to pass the next one over to Alicia, who has done a lot of work on equity for SEL 4NJ, and she's going to introduce these 2 briefs. So over to you, Alicia.
Thanks so much, Liz. The briefs that I'm about to present on, which pertain to anti-bullying and implicit bias reduction or prevention, are very inextricably linked and connected in important ways to what Liz just described, which is the importance of having a positive, inclusive, supportive school climate. And that, again, you know, taking it from the other lens of negative types of interactions, behaviors, a breakdown of that climate, of that trust, of those relationships could lead to some of these things, or these things could be present in an environment if they aren't further examined. And so the relationship between those two things and making sure that if there are observations of, these negative patterns, that they are kind of brought to light. And so I'll talk a little bit about, in order to have a good grasp of not only, how the climate is perceived by different stakeholders in the building, but also how prevalent some of these problematic behaviors like bullying or aggression that fall under a large umbrella could be. You really need to kind of take on some collection of information or data, a systematic process, so that you are able, through various stakeholders' eyes, to get a sense of how things are going. And then SEL is so important in both of those, because SEL builds that framework for maintaining and building those supportive interpersonal relationships, helping to eliminate some of the negative elements that I mentioned, like bullying behavior or kind of unchecked implicit bias, by developing those competencies, both in staff and students, and of course, by extension, parents, caregivers in the community, so that everyone is self-aware, and open to these conversations and building relationship skills and seeing those things enacted in responsible decision-making and just enactment of the pro-social behaviors that we know we'll observe when we are in that positive and supportive school climate. So measurement and tracking is really important to this as well. The briefs that I'm focusing on, again, by looking at anti-bullying, or trying to prevent or minimize the presence of aggressive or bullying behavior, as well as implicit biases, which we know that all of us is a product of growing up in a society and being molded by different norms and different messages we have, is that those are in some cases symptomatic or are able to continue without having a process of correcting them, because of other issues that are present in a school's culture or climate, or because of a lack of leadership or initiative to kind of address them. So again, it's really important to have that leadership to say, SEL is important to us, building a positive climate is important to us. We're going to collect information. We may see some ugly things that we really need to address head on. That may be a painful, difficult process, but that's something that we need to do, because it's so important that all of our staff and students have an equitable access to the conditions that they need to teach and learn and be successful. So part of that is, again, considering what it takes to do high quality data collection with resources available, like surveys, other supports in the state, as well as other methods that can include things as simple as opening dialogue. This is a place, I think, that's really articulated so well in the implicit bias brief about how a student's comment, just opening a safe space for a student to describe how they feel in a particular classroom, led to an examination through tracking of exactly how a teacher who was well-intentioned, maybe less aware of some biases that could keep them from, saying a student's name because they had a difficulty knowing how to pronounce it right away, or from looking at a particular side of the room, how that gets internalized and felt in terms of the perception of climate for one student or a group of students. Similarly, something as big as bullying and negative behaviors can run the gamut and is probably rapidly shifting, transforming, and changing in today's world, where students are just transitioning back from a very disrupted year. Status hierarchies among their peers are disrupted, the ways they're used to communicating and interacting, they're wearing masks. There's a variety of things that kind of lend themselves to patterns that they really should ask students directly about, so that they can have a better sense of the better ways to address them and correct them. Part of this is also, in both of these, examining deeply the interconnection between social emotional learning and the commitment on the part of the school or district, and how that gets translated into the mission, vision, and values of a school. And then in turn, whether the norms that are actually occurring interpersonally in the building are living up to what the mission and vision are. And so really thinking through, what are we committed to, and how does SEL help us strategically get there? And how does it make this a place where certain behaviors between peers, between staff members, because bullying can happen among staff members too, and even from staff to student, these things are not tolerated. They're not part of who we are. And when they happen, we address them in such and such of a way. What's really promising about research-based SEL is the ability both at a school-wide as well as a more targeted level with specific groups or even specific students or staff, is that when aligned properly with very strategic anti-bullying initiatives or anti-bias initiatives, there's a really great symbiosis there, because the SEL competencies promoted by CASEL and also encapsulated in New Jersey's SEL competencies really support the process of preventing exclusionary behavior, promote students' abilities to be self-aware of how they're feeling, to deal with conflict in a positive way, to seek help when they need it, to really embody norms of inclusion and kindness, to be able to notice it being modeled by adults and to then enact it themselves, as well as resisting social pressures that they may feel related to more negative interpersonal interactions with their peers. Reducing bullying and also, of course, reducing bias are extremely important for the promotion of equitable access to high quality conditions for learning and for teaching, and positive and supportive conditions for learning. The flip side of reducing those things that we don't want to see and replacing them with really wonderful interactions and the growth of a community, enable all students to focus on academics and learn effectively, to go back to what Bill touched on. Again, as I mentioned before, there's a lot of disruption that occurred in how students interact and are used to interacting even with their teachers because of the pandemic. There's a high level of stress, high level of conflict in some districts as well over certain issues that people hold near and dear to themselves. And so as we transition back to more of a sense of normal instruction and life in school and come back together in person in many ways, it's important to really focus on the promise that SEL has when aligned with existing programs and approaches and policies, to give parents and caregivers and students a voice in the process, and also to continuously be self-reflective and aware of the importance of culturally responsive and sustaining and equity-oriented approaches to SEL, particularly when we look at things like anti-bullying approaches and district or school level policies, which could have the predisposition to be more punitive and exclusionary, but through the incorporation of SEL in a more restorative lens, really have that promise to help build a more kind of positive and inclusive environment where everyone belongs and gets along for everyone. So with that, I think I'm going to be transitioning back to Dr. Elias.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Alicia. That was great.
All right. So again, I just, so appreciative of the folks that have gone before, because this sets the table for talking about SEL and academics. But the order that we've presented these things in has been highly intentional. The first one that Bill talked about is the brief that is probably most directed toward parents to provide them with a sense of reassurance. Then we've talked about the importance of building a positive, accepting climate. And then Alicia made it very clear that an environment in which there's harassment, intimidation, bullying, and acceptance of bias and bigotry, these are not environments in which kids are going to be able to learn well, because they're going to be too scared, they're going to be too fragmented. And so this is what it is about SEL. It's not about the teaching of the 5 SEL skills alone. It's that SEL provides us guidance for how to make our valued outcomes happen better. And so that is true in academics. And I'm going to talk about that in a second. But if the relational pieces are not in place, then academics are not going to go successfully with our kids. I was at a presentation this morning, Advocates for Children of New Jersey, where there was a lot of talk about accelerating learning to help kids recover from learning loss. And what people started to finally understand is that if we don't accelerate their mental health, then we're not going to be able to accelerate their recovery from learning loss. So the academic areas are critical, but they rest on that foundation of relationships and schools that are free of hate and bigotry. So there are 4 academic areas that we're going to talk about. The fourth one you'll hear about from Kira Rizzuto, arts, visual and performing arts. But the three I want to talk about are social studies, language arts, and STEM. And so just so that we sort of have the idea, it's how indeed does SEL get embedded into these areas. It doesn't supplant the content. It focuses on the process. So for example, in social studies, the brief talks about a strategy, a problem-solving strategy that kids can use to analyze both history and current events that can enable them to focus on the fact that both history and current events involve people making decisions. How did they make those decisions? We can look at history, and kids love to do this. Look at history and think about what decisions were made, how they were made, what the different perspectives were from the different groups involved. And then they can speculate on what if different decisions were made? How might history have turned out differently? It becomes very engaging for our kids, but it also gives them a framework, a problem-solving framework that they can bring into their present and future lives as citizens of their schools. In language arts, there are the building blocks of literature are emotions. And so building kids' emotion vocabulary isn't something that we do for the sake of SEL. We do that for the sake of the kids being able to really appreciate all the literature that they're reading. And then we focus them in their language arts curriculum on things like, well, how do characters express their emotions? How do they make decisions? What efforts do they go to know what the people around them are feeling? At the secondary level, that translates into alternate ways of writing, how different authors write in different ways, how different plot lines get created, how are authors including things relating to culture, gender, ethnicity, ability. So this is all in the standard content, but using SEL guidance to enrich it. And it also involves the process. So when we think about STEM, we think about the benefits to kids of learning together, of peer collaboration, as opposed to individual projects, people coming together to learn, having reflection journals that kids keep so that they not only are learning, but they're getting the opportunity to reflect back on what they've learned. Think about fields like engineering and technology. You got to be pretty precise in those fields. So it's teaching the kids to focus. It's teaching the kids about the importance of attending to detail. These things are no less important in everyday household relationships, but they also are built into the subject matter of STEM. And so this is what we want our kids to do, to be able to not only arrive at an answer, but to explain their reasoning, to develop the habit of checking their work very carefully. Believe me, if any of our kids go into aviation or surgery, we really want them to check their work carefully, right? So these are things that are of tremendous significance. And when they remain implicit, kids don't always get it. When we bring them into the subject matter explicitly, the kids learn it better, and it translates into better performance into their subject areas. So these briefs will give you specific examples of each of those things, but it's also important to help your colleagues who are not on in the meeting with us see these briefs and begin to see that if they want their kids to perform better academically, they need to follow the guidance that SEL provides. And let me turn it over to Kira.
Great, thank you, Maurice. That was fabulous. And over to you, Kira, to talk to us about the arts in SEL.
Thank you so much. I will be brief because I think that Dr. Elias provided so much context about, the ways in which the competencies, the 5 social and emotional learning competencies, really have an opportunity to be enacted throughout various subject areas. And in the arts, we've spent a considerable time in New Jersey really focusing on the intersection of arts education and those social emotional learning competencies and subcompetencies. In this brief, you will see that there's a reference to the arts education and social emotional learning framework, which was when Liz mentioned partnerships early in her introduction. The framework is actually the result of partnerships that took place in the early days of some SEL for NJ meetings, and the task force that developed the framework essentially came together as members of the SEL for NJ community and the Arts Ed New Jersey community, and created a crosswalk of the artistic processes and the 5 SEL competencies. And as a result of that crosswalk, the arts educators, both in our state and now well beyond the boundaries of our state, have a resource that is the Arts Education and Social Emotional Learning framework. And so I see that some folks are dropping links into the chat there. But when you really want the crux of this and you want a quick snapshot of what this looks like in practice, the brief for SEL for NJ really does distill the essential components of this intersection between arts education and social emotional learning. And so when you think about the 4 artistic processes of create, perform, respond, and connect, I think as you consider what the practices are that will result in artistic works, but also the very process nature of arts education, the inquiry-based nature of arts education, I think you'll often see these really rich opportunities for students to practice their social and emotional competencies in ways that both advance their social and emotional learning as well as their artistry. So it's an efficient way to be working. SEL isn't in addition to, it's complementary to an arts education. And I would encourage you to read the brief. And if there are any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out. We hope that you'll find it useful. And if you have questions, we would hope to hear from you. I am going to turn it over for our final segment. Thanks, Liz.
Oh, thank you so much, Kira. And I would encourage everyone to look at that SEL for the Arts website. It is just a trove of resources. And it is just such a wonderful thing that this was birthed from a bunch of people just getting together, trying to figure out how we can, work together. And so it's a huge success story, I think, for New Jersey and for the country. You guys have been sharing that far and wide, all of the work on the SEL crosswalk and things. It's fabulous. So with that said, Christy, our lovely colleague Christy, had to hop off. So I'm going to share just very briefly about this really important brief, SEL and career readiness. What this brief does, it crosswalks SEL skills and competencies with a report that was done by McKinsey. I believe it was McKinsey a number of years ago, about the skills that employers value, that they're looking for, and that they're not getting enough of. And those skills are primarily what we consider social emotional skills. And so this brief does that crosswalk. And this is incredibly important because quite often we hear from high schools, there's a perception out there like, oh, SEL is for little kids. We teach physics or, and marching band. And yet, at the end of the day, it's this SEL skills we know that will make us successful in careers, in whatever type of activity we go on, the kids go on to after high school, in our personal lives. It's those core social emotional competencies. And if you don't have them, that's what's getting people into trouble, further down the road, why they're not coping in college or why they're not getting, through their apprenticeship or whatever. So this is incredibly important. And it's important not only for schools to understand the incredible importance of social emotional skills and, for life, career success, but also it's really important for corporations, organizations, the workforce, those people who are hiring understand that SEL isn't necessarily just an educational jargon. These are real skills that their students, that their future workers will be much better if they have more of. So this brief does a really good job of kind of explaining that in layman's terms. It helps parents, especially high school parents who are like, hey, we're all about the academics, we've got to get into college, about how a focus on building these skills within a high school, whether it's through service learning or group work, will help them in their lives. So that's all I'm going to say about that. It's really worth a read. And we hope to be focusing more on this in the future. So with that said, we are going to quickly just kind of, I talked a little bit about, earlier, I think I put this slide, at the top about focus, our focus for the first half of this 2020. This SEL4NJ is SEL for all of us. And so you, people on the call, those people who couldn't get on the call, are very much a part of this organization, and we really encourage you to help shape it. And one of the things that we're hoping to do too is, when we talk about these briefs, we'd love to put together living, breathing examples about how these things are being implemented and brought to life within schools. This morning, Trish and I facilitated a conversation with a bunch of principals, and they were talking all about connection. It just kind of bubbled up as the topic. And so many amazing examples of connection were shared, activities to encourage connection. We'd love to build those under the briefs, real life examples. So we encourage you to share those real life examples on SEL Day as your artifact, as well as to share them with us so that we can start to bring these briefs to life. So we're entering into the latter part of our day. I believe we have 5 minutes left in this part of the session for any questions, comments, conversation. And then a bunch of us are willing to stay on the call between 5 and 5:30 if you'd like to have a deeper conversation about any of these topics or any other topics you'd like. And depending on how many people are with us, we can decide how to divvy everybody up or to have it as a group. So please share a question within. I'm going to stop sharing my screen so we can see everyone. And so for this part of it, please feel free to unmute, use the hand raise function, but I think there's more of us that are on. So feel free to unmute if you have a question or share it in the chat and we can find you that way. So comments, questions, suggestions.
We have SEL and world languages conversation going on in the chat and request, and then SEL and special education, which is
Yes,
a fabulous topic as well.
fabulous.
And in the call this morning that Liz was just referring to, when we had some principals and superintendents, world languages did come up in the context of talking about relationships among students who are identifying as non-binary, transgender. And a comment from one superintendent was he was observing a world language class and realizing and hearing how world languages are binary. And so there's an interesting conversation there. How do you deal with the binary nature of female male language when you have non-binary students in the class? I know that's an aside, but I just wanted to mention that. It was an interesting conversation that we had. There's somebody is typing.
I am. I was responding to the SEL and special ed, in fact. And if I could just, I guess it's easier just to say this. Essentially, it's the same. Kids are kids and teachers are teachers and so on. The only difference I would say is that the kids, many of them are isolated, they're segregated from the general ed kids. To that extent, I think it would, the extent that we want to promote inclusion and the feeling that the kids are really no different, essentially, than other kids, is to maybe focus on that. if there's any relationships that the kids, the special ed kids have to the other kids, to talk about that and their own feelings about whether or not they feel that they merit being part of the general population, part of the general community. And I think that would help to get at their own sense of their self-worth or not, and how we could focus on that. So without being very wordy about it, which I tend to be, I think the essential is that kids are kids, and they really are part of the general community, and to how to get them to feel that way.
I was the one that brought that up, and I've taught 25 years of self-contained, and I understand your point explicitly. I mean, completely. The problem I have is we don't talk about emotion until we have kids in crisis, and we don't deal with the things that brought our kids to crisis in the first place. And I have to say, my school district, my school particularly, does a fabulous job with mentoring, pairing non-disabled and differently abled children together. But the problem is I think our special ed population, it has to be much more direct than even the explicit teaching that goes on in SEL. So I think that was my interest in learning more about it, because special ed has basically been my entire career. And I work with some really difficult children on the autistic spectrum. So the connection between SEL and self-regulation and things like that have been driving a lot of my work for the last 2 years. That was my basic gist of when I said SEL and special education, but I absolutely agree with you 100%.
Well, it sounds to me like you're ahead of the curve. Just the fact that you thought about that and asked that question means that you're very sensitive to that. And in special ed with it, I don't know about your particular district, sometimes there's more flexibility in the curriculum and in the topics and so on, that maybe you can just try and introduce that, even though there's no crisis. There's always things going on, as I'm sure you know.
Absolutely.
So just use that, yeah. But it's great to hear that question. I think it's a great question.
I'm going to share a resource in the chat tonight. If you're not zoomed out, there's actually a webinar taking place that's going to focus on the intersection of social and emotional learning and student empowerment in neurodiverse population. So I'll just drop that link. And if you're not able to watch it tonight for some reason, you can always watch it on demand. There may be some things that are tangentially related or directly related. I'm not sure, but I'll drop the link.
So Jennifer, thanks for sharing that comment about your experiences with the binary nature of Spanish in the classroom. I'd love to hear even more.
How if the adults in the building been lately in your buildings? How are they doing at the moment, given that it's December, we're a couple of months in, kind of?
I love that.
Like, yeah.
I would say that everybody's on edge.
Sorry?
Everybody's on edge.
Everybody's on edge.
Stressed. Everybody's super stressed.
I said we're putting Band-Aids on gaping wounds at this point.
Right.
So
yeah.
We've been hearing people call it April tired. That people are April tired now.
Yeah, and Maurice just asked, and you know, are the stressed adults kind of the April tired stressed adults? Is that kind of passing on to the kids, those feelings?
Yeah, you know, I've heard a couple of different accounts where kids' anxieties almost directly can be traced to things that they've heard adults say, including their parents. And I don't think people do that intentionally. But what I do think is that sometimes adults don't recognize that, you know, they always say, well, the kids never listen. Of course, the kids listen to what you don't want them to say.
Right.
And so when you start talking about stuff like this, they listen. And it's, I think it is important for adults to be reflecting on the fact that, you know, what they think is obvious and casual may not even be on the kid's radar screen.
I think this point about, I think the emphasis on adult behavior, which everyone here has done explicitly or implicitly, is really critical. I mean, what we've been seeing at the hospitals and clinically is, and nationally as well, of course, is an increase in adolescent and some younger children self-harm and, you know, really problematic behavioral struggles. And I think what's been suggested, I think it's reasonable to suggest, certainly what I think is that all of that, or almost all of it, has to do with adult behavior and beyond their own families, and mostly not even their own families necessarily, but just looking at the way adults are behaving on the national scene and in all kinds of ways has destabilized the setting in which adolescent development takes place tremendously. You know, in every area, from addressing bullying to strong climate, all of it, adult behavior is really key.
Yeah, and when adults are, you know, in theory should be the steady ship through adolescence, right? When the adults are all over the place, it's hard. And we're just hearing that, you know, increases in classroom, you know, management issues and lots of disciplinary issues because, you know, the adults don't have enough bandwidth to look, you know, what's causing the behavior, to look underneath. And so it's, as you said, Band-Aids on gaping wounds. So it's hard. So we're trying to figure out, you know, what we can do and what we can amplify, what we can do to really support the staff. And that's hard now too, because this has gone on quite a while. And what people need are different things. And then it's hard when it's just quite unstable. So any ideas, if you've seen in your schools or organizations, things that have really helped settle people down, created some more space for them to be able to cope, we'd love to be able to learn from that and share it.
My school created a Zen Den actually with grant money we received pre-pandemic. The only problem is with the pandemic and the situation, we're not able to use it to the extent that we want to, because the kids can't sit next to each other on a pillow, or they, you know, so we've been trying, I guess, at least in the school in which I'm in, for a long time to try and address these things without formally addressing them. And now that, you know, and then, you know, one person asked me today, what is the Zen Den for? And I'm like, well, it's a great space to calm and be mindful, but you can't use it with your class because they can't sit that close to each other. And then you have to worry about contact tracing, you know, so it's a double-edged sword, I think, at this point.
One thing I can say we do have been touching that I would recommend is years ago we had our staff telling us that their mental health was a problem, and so we knew that we couldn't just make them happy or just give them mental health, and wanted them to learn or support their learning of mental health practices, and also in a way that we thought that they could then appreciate and then transfer to their classrooms for the kids. So we now do, after at every in-service day where it involves adult learning, we leave the last portion of the day for choice staff wellness workshops, whether it be yoga or mindfulness or, you know, stress reduction, or we bring in experts and provide it for the adults for themselves. We've been doing that now for a few years. Staff have always said that they really appreciate it. I can't say I know for a fact that it's led to greater staff mental health or not, but at the very least, it also sends a message to them that says, if you appreciate this as an adult learner, couldn't you do some of these practices, in your classroom, either the very beginning of class, very end of class, to promote that for the kids as well as learners as well.
Related to a topic here, Paul Krugman has an opinion column in yesterday's New York Times, and it's titled, "Where Have All the Grown-Ups Gone?" So you're hitting right on a hot topic here.
Yeah. Yeah, and we were on another call a week or so ago and talking about how, having increases in conflict amongst the kids is hard, and between, everybody being masked all the time, is that it's very hard to read emotions sometimes, especially for young kids and especially for adolescents. And especially for the little ones, we're still learning. But we're noticing anecdotally people sharing that there's more increases in conflict amongst students, amongst girls. And we were kind of positing on this call whether some of this could be with the mask wearing, they're not able to read emotions as easily. And so there's some fixes, potential fixes out there. I mean, not fixes, but ways of maybe if there's conflict resolution, or if even being able to get staff outside without masks on. We know one principal who has the chairs set up so that staff can go outside and be with each other without masks for a while. Doing that sort of thing, just encouraging a chance to see emotion can help a little bit. It's a small, teensy, but it's just a little anecdote.
Amy, did you want to share something?
Hi, yes, I have a question about the grant program that's due December 10th. They always say procrastinators are optimists, right? So, yeah. So it's going to get done. So, I guess I was just wondering, I definitely want to apply for it. And, I think responsive classroom in their trainings is what I would go for. But I was just wondering if, what other ideas have been submitted in terms of potential programs that can help my school. I feel like that's where I'm struggling. I don't really know any, and even responsive classroom, I want to call them to say, because they have a 4-day workshop, it looks like, but there's only postings for September. So I need to get more information from them. So I was just wondering if there was any ideas or what other people are applying for in terms of programs, because I just am unaware of, and I'm kind of Googling, and so that's my question. Thank you.
Well, it's a good question, and I don't know what people have been applying for because we haven't opened up the applications yet. But we know that when some of the ideas that came up in terms of the sorts of things that would be appropriate for this type of funding, anything really that's developing the capacity of a teacher, kind of long term, and that they're able to share with colleagues. So it's not a one-off training necessarily, but something that can really build their capacity that they can then turnkey and or implement. So things like, for instance, SEL coaching, maybe taking part in some kind of an online academy or of sorts that that's long-term, that will really build the capacity that the teacher can actually turnkey and or implement. And also we're really encouraging those projects that incorporate an equity lens is very important. So it's kind of vague because we're kind of encouraging people to be a bit creative. But it's that sort of thing. Does anybody else, if anyone else has any other ideas of what people have applied for, or I think somebody did mention they were doing a really cool thing with yoga, but in a way that was actually tying it in to different, teaching everybody so that they could implement in their classrooms. There was somebody told me that they were going to be applying for integrating SEL into math, their math program. And I thought that was a really interesting idea. Yeah, I think there's some training, professional development, long-term on DEI, like on foundational sort of DEI things.
Liz, who can submit?
It has to be a teacher in New Jersey, and you can, if it's a district-wide, there's somebody can submit on behalf of the teacher, but the teacher has to be the recipient. Oh, and SEL in the arts, that's a great thing to apply for, actually, integrating professional development, partnering with an artist or an artist organization, that sort of thing. So basically, it's for teachers, and it's for the grant is $1,500 if it's an individual, up to $1,500, or up to $2,500 if it's a group. The idea is that the applicant identifies a professional development partner for them to use the money to receive professional development. And then part of the grant application is that they then integrate this into their practice and somehow share it with the rest of the school.
Thank you.
I have an idea to share. I don't know if this is the right 25 people receptive for it or not, but just to share. So there's been a tremendous emphasis, I'm sure Sal, Barry, and others know, on trauma, both screening for trauma in kids, ACEs, all that, and therefore the importance of trauma-informed care, including those approaches for kids in schools. And I've attended several recent conferences with trauma folks, Bessel van der Kolk and all that, who's so out there on this. And what Van Kolk has been talking about is the importance for kids with trauma histories of participating in what he calls body expressive activities, including, he specifically mentions kids participating in theater exercises, group theater. And he also specifically gave an example at a recent conference of kids participating in choral activities. In other words, the arts themselves as a trauma-informed activity for kids with those histories, which is such high percentages of kids. I think it'd be very interesting if somebody applied within this SEL grant framework for an arts project of that kind that tried to engage kids in those kinds of activities with that kind of goal in mind, of providing some healing mechanisms for trauma care. I don't know what Sal or Barry in particular might say to that, but.
Well, Stuart, one thing I can tell you is there was recently a bill signed into law that would screen kids 7th grade to 12th grade in mental health screening. And the department's in the process of determining how to implement that. And we had a chance to meet with the assistant director of special education, I guess a week or so ago, to get involved with, talk about how this is going to be done and what they should be thinking about. And it's for all children. And it was a very good meeting with him, and he's very open to talking to us about this. And I think we raised some issues that he was interested in. So I think that could be a very positive thing.
The other thing that's been well received is mental health first aid training for teachers. And the responses from the teachers who have done that training is not just that they feel more able, skilled, and confident in recognizing and intervening and reducing conflict and crisis situations, but that it also helped them and their families. So I just thought that's interesting. It's been around for quite some time, and so staff can be certified as mental health first aid trainers themselves and turnkey that, which might be helpful given what Barry's talking about that might be coming down the pike.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think what Stu mentioned and what Barry added to that is the idea that we're talking about emotion and knowing your own emotions. So using theater arts is, I wouldn't say obvious, but it's a very important way of doing things because that's the focus to begin with. For kids who are interested in that, that's a good entree. Maybe if we can get more kids interested in a sense, opening up, that might be something to encourage with respect to that. It's a little more difficult when you talk about math or social studies, but still, as of course, as Maurice has shown, that's a very adept way of doing that. With regard to the depression screening, when we met with Damien, right? Some of the concerns we had, and maybe it applies in this sense as well, are that it's a good idea, of course, to focus on kids who may have various kinds of issues. On the other hand, that can be overdone. And sometimes the emphasis on the negative, which we have to pay attention to as depression or potential suicide, it may be more palatable to look for the positives. So even when we're looking at kids who may show, and the universal screening is sometimes there's a lot of false positives, but if we can look at what the skills are, the positives that the kids have, and work from that. Just as, for example, when child study folks are asked to evaluate kids for possible special ed, which is the worst way to go about it, and I won't go into that length. But the question then should be not what the kids do wrong, not what's wrong with them, what their gaps are, but what can they do right? What are their skills? And again, to focus on that as SEL does in a more preventive way and earlier on, so that the kids, most of them don't get to that point. That's a very tough attitude to get across to folks. Of course, we all take for granted that everybody should function on a quote normal, whatever that means, normal level. So if there's a deviation from that in a way that makes us uncomfortable, that's when we begin to say, oh, there's something wrong with the kid. The medical model, the kid has a disease that he or she is carrying around with them. So let's fix that. Let's go to some other place. Let's take him out of the group and put him somewhere else so they don't contaminate everybody else, which is exactly the wrong thing to do. So I think the focus needs to be, as it is in SEL, on being aware of your own emotions. And in that case, that's where the staff, it's very important for the staff and the parents to be aware of their attitudes. So if there's a way that we can do SEL, so to speak, with the staff, that's, I think, the crucial kind of thing. And the kids will, as somebody said before, the kids will model on that. I can go on, but I should stop there.
I know there were a couple of references to these connections between the arts and social and emotional development. And I do want to say that a lot of our cultural partners have been developing professional learning. We at Arts Ed New Jersey and Arts Ed SEL have also been developing professional learning. So if anyone has an interest to explore this deeper, whether it's for the purposes of the grant application or more long-term, I'm happy to share resources and even just sort of brainstorm if you're not quite sure where to start. I'll drop my email address for anyone who would like to reach out. But there's been a lot of work done in our state looking at the intersection, but also building some capacity for this so that it can be, we have a mantra that social and emotional learning should be embedded, intentional, and sustained in our arts programs. And so we've really been trying through the strong leadership actually of Dr. Maurice Elias and the director of Arts Ed New Jersey, who can't be here, but his name is Bob Morrison. We've really been able to work through our state and now through the work of the Arts Ed SEL Center beyond our state to build capacity in this area. So as I said, if anyone is interested in exploring this intersection further, I'm always happy to discuss.
Can I just say something?
Because I wanted to build on what Saul said about, really taking an asset-based approach, not taking a deficit mindset, but really taking an asset-based approach. And that's something in the arts that we our learning we can do in more intentional ways when we look at those creative processes. I'm sorry, Jamie, were you about to say something else?
I actually was just going to comment. I'm sorry, I didn't realize you were still going. Maurice Elias wrote about screenings. My school district screened every student pre-K to 12, and that's the exact problem that we ran into. Was that, you know, at the elementary school I'm at, we turned over every rock to see what was under it, and then there's just me to take care of it all. So the resources were not there. Once all the needs really came out and people, you know, we started digging. And so that is exactly what we found. So that's a good point to the screening of individual, you know, how they're feeling and how they're doing. You know, you have to have the resources to back up the possible data that can come out of that. So I just wanted to share that.
Mm-hmm.
Does anyone else have any other questions or comments?
Just one other thing. I have, this seems like the perfect group to toss this out to. I'd love to get some feedback. I developed an assessment key, an essay assessment key based on college art history student essays. And I developed the processes that they went through, that they wrote in their essays, their thinking process based on Dewey, you know, but to get them to transformation. And I can demonstrate that they were transformed because of awe and wonder that they had for their selected object. And then I also, you know, contrast Dewey with Chinese aesthetic terms, because our language, English language, is very limited when it comes to aesthetic terms about art. You know, you're talking about emotions, you know, but how many, you know, just how many terms can you use? It's beautiful, you know, ethereal or something. So I also include that in the thinking processes. So I don't know if that would be of interest. This is, you know, with the art, and then, you know, with the world culture, you know, portion of it too. And then using as an example, a sculpture of a Chinese bodhisattva, a Buddhist bodhisattva, but she takes many forms. She has 34 forms, and they are male and female. And the students love the sculpture, but they don't see it in the way of transgender. Do you know, so it's very interesting how they respond. They respond more into almost a prayerful way, you know, because her attribute is listening. So anyway, I have that. It's based on 25 years of my college teaching. So I just put that out there.
Thank you. There are a couple of college profs on the call right now, so I'm sure you have some colleagues here.
Yes, thank you, Kira.
We are actually thinking about assessment very deeply. So I think that it would be wonderful to see the approach you've taken.
I would love to share it with you. Thank you.
Well, we're coming down to our last few minutes. So just want to say that it's so wonderful that everybody could join us this afternoon. And, you know, we'd love to continue the conversation and to hear from you. We hope to be sending out more frequent sort of communications. And of course, we'll be hearing from us about SEL Day, but also a lot of, you know, what falls behind SEL Day as well. So please continue to reach out. We'll do our best to, you know, communicate back. And most importantly, please let us know if you have ideas and if you'd like to participate more in any way. You know, this is a volunteer organization and we welcome everyone into the mix. And, you know, we just would like to just extend all of our gratitude and thanks to all of you for all that you do. And, you know, just it's awfully dark for 5:27. Just like to comment on that. It's like,
Is that an emotional statement?
emotional. And I like the winter and the cold and the dark. I like to kind of like cozy up, but it's really dark out there.
I have one last question. If I am a school counselor, can I apply for that grant? If I rope a teacher into it, who I already have a teacher in mind?
Yeah,
that
the implementation has to, yes, you can apply, but it has to be the teacher who's having the experience and the teacher who would be participating in the learning cohort.
Oh, I see. So then it's not like the teacher and myself can do it together. It would be the teacher who would go to the training and then
You could, there's an info@grants@SEL4NJ email. You could ask that question, and we do have somebody who's coordinating the whole grants project.
Okay.
And he'd be able to, you know, kind of address that concern. Overall, what we're trying to do is really encourage, you know, the teachers, you know, who are in the classroom development. But that doesn't mean that other people can't be part of the mix. But if you send an email to that email address, then you'll get an official answer.
Okay, thank you so much.
From the person who's coordinating it.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Yeah. But we're really excited about this, actually, and the Jets have been wonderful partners in making this possible. It's just great. Okay, everyone. Well, if there's nothing else, we can go on to have hopefully a wonderful evening. So, and hope to see you all soon.
Take care, everyone.
Okay.
Thanks, Liz. I think that went great.
Yeah, I think it was great.
Yeah, I think everybody did a great job and it did all that was intended. And, you know, it's a good model to be used for future things. I think in particular, when the presenters were brief, what they did very succinctly and then moved right along. I think that was the strongest part of the process. Like boom, from you to Maurice to, you know, to Bill, etc. I think that worked perfectly. Keeping things short is so important.
Oh, that's good.
Not that I'm good at it, but I really admire. I admire the people who did do that.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I completely agree. It was a wonderful structure, wonderful, smooth process, I think. And I jumped in a little bit late. Sorry, I was coming from class, but I thought it was great. And they were very engaged.
We were listening.
Yes. Yeah. So I
hope look at the chats.
Yeah.
So many chats.
Yeah.
It was really, I should probably stop.
It was the right group of people.